The morning Harriet Gentry found the bank's final notice pinned to her front door with a rusted nail. She did not cry. She had used up every last tear 6 months ago, standing over her husband's grave in the red clay earth of Caldwell County, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and she had made herself a promise then that she would not waste another drop of herself on grief when there was still work to be done. She pulled the paper free, read it twice with the kind of slow deliberateness that comes from not wanting to believe what your eyes are telling you, and then she folded it into a neat square and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. 60 days. That was what the Caldwell Savings and Loan had given her. 60 days to pay the outstanding balance on the land note her late husband, Thomas Gentry, had taken out 3 years prior to buy the seed and fencing that had transformed their modest homestead into something that almost resembled a working cattle and wheat farm. $340 was what she owed. In the year 1882, on the southern Texas plains, that was not a small sum for a widow of 31 with 900 acres of cracked earth, 40 head of cattle, one aging workhorse named Biscuit, and a hired hand named Orville who was 63 and walked with a limp from an old injury he never fully explained. She stood on the porch and looked out across her land as the morning sun climbed the pale sky. The grass was thin and yellowed from the summer drought that had come on hard and early. The creek that ran along the eastern fence line was down to a trickle. The wheat field her husband had planted the previous autumn was scraggly and uneven, half of it gone to rust and insects. The cattle were lean. Everything about the Gentry farm was lean, stretched thin as the skin over a hollow drum, and the sound it made when life pressed against it was a sound close to breaking. Harriet went back inside, stood in the kitchen, and allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of despair. She counted them in her head. Then she tied on her work gloves, walked out to the barn, and began her day. Orville was already there, pitching hay with the slow, careful rhythm of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that his body could not move the way it once had. He looked up when she came in, and something in his weathered face told her he already knew about the notice, the way old men who have lived long enough always seem to know things before they are told. 60 days, she said, because there was no point in dancing around it. I heard Calhoun's man rode out yesterday, Orville said, meaning Vernon Calhoun, president of the Caldwell Savings and Loan, and the man who had been quietly eyeing the Gentry property for the better part of 2 years. Calhoun wanted the land. Everyone in Caldwell County knew it. He had already swallowed up 3 other farms along the ridge, paying pennies to widows and desperate men, and adding the acreage to his growing empire. The Gentry farm sat right in the middle of his intended expansion, and Thomas Gentry had been the only man stubborn enough to refuse every offer Calhoun had sent his way. Thomas was gone now, and Harriet, for all her stubbornness, was alone. "I'm not selling to him," she said. "Never thought you were," Orville replied and went back to his pitching. She spent the morning taking stock of everything she had, which was a painful exercise in arithmetic. The 40 cattle, if she drove them to market in Wichita Falls right now, would fetch maybe $1.25 a head, which was nowhere near enough. The wheat that remained was too sparse and too damaged to sell at a real profit. She had 24 laying hens, a kitchen garden that was fighting the drought with admirable stubbornness, and a root cellar full of canned goods that would see her through winter if winter ever came. What she did not have was cash money, and what she needed was a plan. She rode into the town of Millhaven that afternoon on Biscuit, who moved with the dignified slowness of an animal that has accepted its twilight years, but has not yet given up on them entirely. Millhaven was a small town, the kind that had sprung up along the rail spur like most West Texas towns, with a main street of weathered board buildings, and a population that swelled when the cattle drives came through and shrank again when they left. There was a general store run by a Greek immigrant named Stefanos Papadakis, who was one of the kindest men Harriet had ever known. There was a saloon, a livery, a church, a post office, and the white-painted building with the green shutters that housed the Caldwell Savings and Loan. She stopped at the general store first, because she needed flour and salt, and because Stefano's always made her feel as though the world was not entirely conspiring against her. He was behind the counter when she came in, a broad-shouldered man of about 50 with a magnificent gray mustache and eyes that had seen considerable trouble and come out the other side with their warmth intact. He knew about the notice, too, because in Millhaven word traveled faster than horses. "Harriet," he said, and the way he said her name was a whole conversation by itself. "I need flour and salt," she said, "and I need you to tell me if you have heard of anyone looking for work, a farmhand, someone who knows cattle." Stefano set her items on the counter and thought for a moment, pulling at his mustache. "Cattle drives are mostly finished for the season," he said. "But there was a man in here this morning, asked about ranches in the area that might need an extra hand. Left about an hour ago, heading toward the Reardon place." "What kind of man?" Harriet asked. "The kind that looks like he knows what he is doing," Stefano said simply. "Quiet, polite. Paid for his coffee with real coin." Harriet bought her flour and salt, loaded them into the saddlebag across Biscuit's broad back, and rode toward the Reardon place, which was about 2 miles east on the old post road. She did not know exactly what she was going to say or what she could possibly offer a skilled hand by way of wages, but desperation has a way of making a person bold in directions they would not normally travel. She found him about 1.5 miles out, not at the Reardon place at all, but sitting on the top rail of the old split-log fence that bordered the Reardon property line, looking out across the plain with the kind of easy stillness that belongs to men who are comfortable inside their own silence. He was 34 or 35, she guessed, lean and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his faded blue shirt. His hat was pushed back on his head in the casual way of a man who is not currently working but is always ready to be. His boots were worn but clean. His horse, a fine-looking gray roan, was tied to the post below him. He heard her coming because men like that always do, and he turned his head to look at her with dark brown eyes that were calm and direct, and did not carry any of the shiftiness or false brightness that she had learned to be wary of in strangers. "You looking for the Reardon place?" she asked, drawing Biscuit to a stop a few yards away. "I was," he said in a voice that was low and even, "but it appears no one is home." "Caleb Reardon sold out last spring," she said. "Moved his family to San Antonio." He nodded, unsurprised, as though the world reorganizing itself without his knowledge was something he had grown accustomed to. He climbed down off the fence in one easy motion and touched the brim of his hat. "Paul Chandler," he said. "Harriet Gentry," she said. There was a pause, the kind where both people are sizing each other up not out of suspicion, but out of the particular carefulness of people who have been burned before and cannot afford to be burned again. "Stefano's Papadakis at the general store said you were looking for ranch work," she said. "I am," Paul said. "I have a farm," she said. 900 acres east of Millhaven. 40 head of cattle, a wheat field that has seen better days, and about 60 days before the bank takes it from me if I cannot show sufficient income. She said it all plainly, the way you lay cards on a table when you have decided that bluffing is a waste of everyone's time. "I cannot pay much. I can pay room and board and a share of whatever profit the farm turns between now and the end of October. If I save it, we both come out ahead. If I do not, there is nothing to pay." Paul Chandler looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand fully before they commit to it, and she held his gaze because she had nothing to hide and no energy left for pretending. "What happened to the farm?" he asked. "My husband died," she said. "February. Heart gave out without warning. He was 37 years old and the healthiest man I knew, and then he was gone. The debts he left were not unreasonable, but they were more than I can manage alone." "What happened to the wheat?" he said. "Drought came early and I did not have enough hands to get it irrigated properly. I have one hand, Orville begs, who is 63 and capable and willing but limited in what he can do alone. Paul was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "What is the debt?" $340. He looked out across the plain, then back at her. Something moved across his face that she could not quite name, but it was not pity, which she was grateful for, because pity was the one thing that would have made her turn Biscuit around and ride home alone. "Then let us start today," he said. Those 5 words hit her somewhere in the center of her chest with a force she was not prepared for, not because they were romantic or particularly beautiful, but because they were exactly what she needed to hear from someone who meant them. She had spent months surrounded by people who said things like, "I am sorry for your trouble, and I will pray for you, and you ought to consider selling." And here was a man she had met 5 minutes ago who said, "Let us start today." "You have not even seen the place," she said. "Show it to me on the way," he said, and untied his roan. They rode together back toward the Gentry farm, and she showed it to him as they went, narrating the boundaries and the history of the land the way you talk about something you love and are afraid of losing, which is to say, with a mixture of pride and grief that colors every sentence. The creek that ran along the eastern fence had once been a strong and dependable water source, enough to irrigate the near field and water the cattle comfortably. The drought had cut it down. The far pasture, where the cattle were grazing, was dry but had enough grass still to support the herd if managed carefully. The barn was solid, built by Thomas in the first year they had the land, and she said his name without flinching because she had made her peace with saying it even when it hurt. Paul listened to all of it without interrupting, which she noticed and appreciated. He asked questions at the right moments, about the soil composition in the wheat field, about the cattle breed, which was a mix of Longhorn and Hereford, sturdy and heat-tolerant, about the fence lines and whether the eastern fence was holding, about the well, which was deep and had not gone dry even in the worst of the summer heat. When they rode through the gate and into the yard, Orville was sitting on an upturned bucket outside the barn, sharpening a blade, and he looked up at Paul Chandler with the careful evaluation of a man who has lived long enough to know that a stranger's intentions are not always readable from the outside. "Orville," Harriet said, "this is Paul Chandler. He is going to help us through the season." Orville looked at Paul for a long moment, then held out his hand. Paul shook it. "You know cattle?" Orville asked. "Spent 6 years on a working cattle ranch in New Mexico Territory," Paul said. "Before that, 2 years in Kansas. I know cattle." Orville looked at Harriet and gave a very small nod, the kind that means more than it looks like it does when it comes from a man who gives them rarely. "The spare room in the bunkhouse," Harriet said to Paul. "It is not large, but it is clean and dry and the roof holds." "That is all I need," he said. She showed him around the farm herself, because she knew every inch of it and because she found that talking about it with him helped her see it more clearly, the way explaining something to someone always sharpens your own understanding of it. She showed him the wheat field, what was left of it, and he walked through the rows with her, crouching down to examine the soil and the remaining stalks, and she watched him think. "The rust damage is significant," he said, "but not total. The western portion of the field, about 30 acres, is clean enough. If we cut and dry what is there now and get it to market before the end of September, it will not be a great sum, but it will be something. The question is the cattle." "The cattle," she agreed. "Your herd is thin," he said, standing back up and brushing the red dirt from his knee. "But they are healthy enough. 40 head at the current market price will not cover your debt alone. But there is a cattle buyer in Wichita Falls, a man named Breckett, who runs a legitimate operation and pays better than the average stockyard. I have dealt with him before. If we can fatten the herd between now and late October, 30 of the strongest animals at Breckett's price would get you close." "Close is not $340, she said. "No," he agreed. "But close plus the wheat plus whatever else we can turn on this land between now and then might be." He looked at her steadily. "It is going to require a great deal of work." "I have never been afraid of work," she said. "I know," he said, and she did not know how he could know that from an hour's acquaintance, but the way he said it made her feel that he actually did. They ate dinner that evening at the long kitchen table, the three of them, Harriet having made a pot of beans with salt pork and corn bread, and it was the fullest the table had felt since Thomas died. Paul ate with the quiet appetite of a man who appreciates a good meal because he has done without enough times to know the difference, and he told them a little about himself between bites. He was originally from Virginia, which surprised her slightly because there was nothing about him that suggested the East. He had come west at 22 after his family's tobacco farm failed in the aftermath of the post-war years, when the land was there, but the economy that had supported it had been rearranged entirely, and there was nothing left for a young man with no capital and a strong back but to go west and find his fortune in the wide, remorseless space of the frontier. He had not found his fortune exactly, but he had found his competence, which he seemed to consider an equally valuable thing. He had worked ranches in Kansas, in New Mexico Territory, and briefly in Colorado. He was not married. He did not explain why, and she did not ask, because some questions you do not ask on the first evening. After dinner, when she was washing up and Paul had stepped outside to tend to his horse, Orville sat at the table with his coffee cup and said, without looking up from it, "He is a good man." "You can tell that already?" she asked. "I have been watching men for 63 years, Orville said. "I can tell." She did not say anything else, but she thought about it while she scrubbed the pot clean, the way a thought sometimes settles into you quietly without making any noise at all. The next morning she was up before sunrise, which was her custom, and she was startled to find that Paul Chandler was already up before her. She came into the barn to find him there in the gray pre-dawn light, already working, already moving with the calm, purposeful efficiency of a man who does not waste his mornings. He had the cattle sorted by the time she arrived, picking out the thinner animals and making mental notes that he transferred to a small paper notebook he carried in his breast pocket. "You are up early," she said, which was an unnecessary thing to say, but she said it anyway because she was slightly thrown off by not being the first one there. "Always have been," he said, without looking up from his notebook. "Mornings are when the work gets done." "I have always thought the same thing," she said. He looked up then, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to one, and she felt her own face doing something similar, and then they both looked away and went to work. Those first weeks had a quality she would remember later as something like organized intensity. They worked from before dawn until after dusk every day, all three of them, with Harriet taking the kitchen and the near pasture and the morning milking, Orville managing the cattle fence and the feeding, and Paul organizing the larger strategy of what needed to happen and by when. He was a planner, she discovered, the kind of man who thinks 3 steps ahead without being rigid about it, who can adapt when the plan meets reality and comes out something different. He reinforced the fence along the eastern border, which had been sagging and threatening to let the cattle drift. He got the irrigation trench running again along the wheat field's western edge, using a combination of river stone and clay that rerouted the creek's diminished flow in a way that was clever enough that it made her stand and stare at it for a moment when he showed her. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "A Zuni man in New Mexico Territory showed me," he said. His people had been farming arid land for centuries with techniques that the rest of us are still catching up to. He said it simply, without the dismissiveness or condescension that she had heard from other men when they spoke of native peoples, and she filed that observation away somewhere important. The days were full and relentless, and exhausting in the physical way that leaves your body hollowed out by evening, and Harriet found that she slept more deeply than she had in months, which she attributed entirely to the work, and not at all to any sense of security that came from not being alone. She was very firm with herself about that. But the evenings were something different. After supper, when the long work of the day had wound itself down and Orville had retired to his bunk and the night came in cool and full of stars, Harriet and Paul sometimes sat on the porch steps and talked. Not about the farm always, about other things. About the country, which was changing so fast that the West of 10 years ago was already almost unrecognizable from the West of today, with the railroad having come through and changed everything the way that rivers change when you dam them upstream. About books, which surprised her, because she had not thought of him as a reading man, but he was. He had a worn copy of a Charles Dickens novel in his saddlebag and had read it through twice. "I did not expect that," she admitted. "People tend not to," he said mildly. "You do not seem to mind," she said. "I spent a long time worrying about what people expected," he said. "Then I got tired of it." She laughed genuinely, for the first time in so long that the sound surprised her. She heard it come out of her and felt a momentary strangeness about it, the way you feel when a house that has been dark for a long time suddenly has a light in the window. He looked at her when she laughed, and there was an expression in his eyes that she chose not to examine too closely just then. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Vernon Calhoun came to call. She saw his buggy coming up the road before he arrived. The black lacquered wheels and the matched pair of bays that he drove everywhere, because he liked people to see him coming from a long way off. She was in the kitchen garden when he pulled up, and she straightened her back and waited because she knew this was not a social call. Calhoun was a tall man, thick through the middle, with a carefully groomed silver beard and the kind of smile that is assembled rather than natural. He stepped down from the buggy and came toward her with his hat in his hand, a gesture of courtesy that she had always found faintly theatrical. "Mrs. Gentry," he said, "you are looking well." "Mr. Calhoun," she said. "What can I do for you?" He looked around the property with eyes that were measuring things, the way a buyer looks at something he already plans to own. Then he looked at the barn where Paul was visible through the open doors, mending a piece of harness with quick, practiced hands. "I see you have acquired help," Calhoun said. "I have," she said. "Mrs. Gentry," he said, shifting to his more serious tone, the one that was meant to sound like concern, "I want you to know that my offer stands. $400 for the property and the herd. It is a generous price, more than the bank will give you if it comes to foreclosure, which I fear it very well might." $400 was more than the debt. She knew that. She also knew that $400 for 900 acres of good West Texas land, even drought-affected land, was a robbery conducted with a fountain pen. "Thank you for your concern," she said, "but I am not selling." Calhoun's smile did not waver, but his eyes shifted slightly. "It is a difficult road you are choosing," he said. "It is my road," she said, "and it is my farm." He stayed another few minutes, talking pleasantly about the weather and the state of the markets, the way men who have been refused something sometimes stay a little longer than necessary to reassert that they are not troubled by it. Then he got back in his buggy and drove away. Paul appeared at her side as Calhoun's buggy rounded the bend in the road. She had not heard him come up, but she was not startled. "Calhoun," she said, not really as an explanation, but more to acknowledge that he probably understood the situation. "I know who he is," Paul said. "I asked Stefanos about the local players when I first came through town. He has swallowed up half the county already," she said. "He is not going to swallow this," Paul said, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled something in her that had been vibrating with tension. "You are very sure," she said. "I am sure that we are going to work hard enough to make sure of it," he said. She looked at him then, this man who had been a stranger to her less than a month ago and now moved through her mornings and evenings as though the farm had always known him, and she felt something shift in her chest that she was not quite ready to put a name to. The work continued. September came in with its particular West Texas quality. Still hot in the afternoons, but with mornings and evenings that carried the first suggestions of autumn, a coolness in the air that felt like a promise being kept after a very long delay. The wheat field's western 30 acres were cut and dried and bundled, with Paul and Harriet working side by side through 3 full days of it, Orville managing the cattle while they brought in what remained of the crop. It was hard, physical, sun-punishing work. And by the end of the third, Harriet's hands were blistered, and her shoulders ached in ways that were almost interesting in their intensity. They sat on the porch that evening, both of them too tired to talk much, and she was holding a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and looking out at the bundled wheat standing in neat rows, and feeling something she had not expected to feel, which was proud. $42, Paul said. He had done the arithmetic twice, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the stub of a pencil and a square of paper. At current prices, the wheat will fetch about $42 in Millhaven, more in Wichita Falls if we can get it there. It is something, she said. It is a beginning, he said. He looked at her over the rim of his own cup and she looked back, and this time neither of them looked away. Something had been building between them with the steady, patient quality of something that is not in a hurry because it knows it is inevitable. The way a river builds against a dam, not dramatically, but persistently, and the silence between them on that porch was full of it. "Paul," she said, and then stopped, because she was not sure what she meant to say after it. "I know," he said, which was maddening because she did not know what she had been going to say, and she certainly did not see how he could know it. "You know what?" she said. He set down his cup and looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "I know that this is not the right moment for whatever I am feeling about you. I know that you are still finding your way through your grief and that I have been here less than a month and that there is a great deal between us that is unfinished and unsaid. I know all of that." She looked at him for a long moment. "And," she said. "And I am a patient man," he said simply. She did not know what to say to that, so she did not say anything, and they sat together in the cooling evening with the stars beginning to appear above the plain, and it was one of the most comfortable silences she had ever sat inside. The following week, they drove the wheat into Millhaven and sold it. $44, because the buyer, a man named Howell who ran the mill on the south edge of town, was in better need of it than Paul had expected, and his offer reflected that. She folded the money carefully into the small tin box she kept in the kitchen and added it to the $11.60 she had managed to save from the egg sales and the kitchen garden produce. $55.60 against $340. It was still a mountain, but the cattle were the real plan. Paul had been fattening the best 30 of the 40 head for the past month, managing their grazing with the careful rotation of someone who knows that land is a resource and not an inexhaustible one, moving them between pastures in a rhythm that kept the grass from being overgrazed anywhere and allowed recovery, where recovery was possible. He had supplemented with hay that he cut from the creek banks in the early mornings and dried in the yard, and the cattle were visibly stronger for it. He wrote a letter to the buyer in Wichita Falls, the man named Breckett, and sent it with the post rider who came through Millhaven twice a week. Breckett's reply came back in 10 days. He was interested. His current price for good quality Longhorn Cross was $2.25 a head, subject to inspection. 30 head at that price was $67.50. Harriet sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic and came up with $123.10, which was still $216.90 short of what she needed. She set the pencil down on the table and pressed her fingers to her forehead and breathed. Paul was sitting across from her. He had been watching her do the arithmetic. "I know what you are thinking," he said. "I am thinking it is not enough," she said. "There are two other things," he said. "First, I have some money saved. Not a fortune, but money. I have been carrying it with me since I left the New Mexico territory because I had not decided where to put it yet." She looked up sharply. "I will not take your money," she said. "It would be a loan," he said, "against the farm's future income. If we bring this place through the season and it starts producing the way it should next year, you would pay me back from the profits. It is an investment, not charity." She looked at him for a long moment, trying to see through to his intentions, and found nothing there but straightforwardness. "How much?" she said. $115, he said. She did the arithmetic again in her head. That was $238.10, Still not 340. You said two things, she said. The second thing, he said, is the timber. What timber? Along the northern boundary of your property where the creek bends, he said. There is a stand of post oak and cedar that has not been touched. I spoke to a man in Millhaven, a builder named Marcus Howe, who is in need of timber for a house he is contracted to build. He will pay $105 for the right to cut from that stand. She stared at him. She had owned that stand of timber for 3 years and had never thought of it as anything but trees. That is $343.10, she said. Plus $3.10 to spare, he said, and there was a warmth in his face that she felt all the way across the table. She sat back in her chair and pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, not because she was going to cry, but because she was overwhelmed in a way that did not fit inside ordinary expression. The farm was going to be saved. The arithmetic said so. The work of the past weeks had been building toward this exact moment, this point where the numbers lined up and it became possible. You planned all of this, she said. The wheat, the cattle, the timber. You had this worked out. I worked it out on the third day I was here, he said. I wanted to be sure it was sound before I said anything. She shook her head slowly. Paul Chandler, she said, you came here as a stranger and you have given more to this farm in a month than most people could in a year. I came here as a man who needed somewhere to be, he said quietly, and found somewhere worth being. The moment sat between them like something visible, like heat off summer stone. I need to ask you something, she said, and her voice was careful and deliberate because she was choosing her words with care. Why? A man with your skills and your history could go anywhere, find work on any ranch in Texas. Why take on a failing farm with a woman who cannot pay you properly and 60 days to some kind of resolution or disaster? He was quiet for a moment, and she did not fill the silence because she wanted him to answer honestly rather than quickly. I have been moving for 12 years, he said. Not running from anything exactly, but not moving toward anything specific either. When you stopped me on that fence post and told me the situation plainly, without asking for sympathy, without performing anything, just laying it out as a matter of fact, I thought to myself, that is a person who deserves a straight answer to match her straight question. He paused. And then I came here and I saw the land and the barn and the way you move through this place like you belong to it, and I thought, this is something worth fighting for. The farm, she said. The farm, he agreed, and the way he agreed with it told her clearly that he meant more than the farm, and she felt her heart do something that was not grief and not desperation, and not the 100 other things it had been doing for the past months. It did something new, something it had almost forgotten how to do, which was reach toward something with hope instead of away from something with fear. She did not say anything else that evening. But before she went to bed, she paused in the doorway of the kitchen and looked back at him, where he was still sitting at the table in the lamplight, reviewing his notes on the cattle. Paul, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze. Get some sleep, he said. We have cattle to drive. They drove the cattle to Wichita Falls at the beginning of October, she and Paul, with Orville holding the farm, and it was a 3-day journey each way over open country that was flat and wide, and enormous in the way that West Texas is enormous. The sky so big above you that you feel simultaneously very small and strangely expanded. They drove 30 head and kept 10 back to start rebuilding the herd the following spring. Driving cattle with Paul Chandler was an exercise in watching someone be entirely themselves in their element. He moved the animals with a quiet authority that came from years of understanding how cattle think, and he showed her things along the way, small things about reading the behavior of the herd, about how to use the terrain to guide them rather than fight them through it. He was a good teacher, patient without being condescending, the kind of person who explains things once clearly and then lets you try it yourself. They made camp each night on the open plain, building a small fire and cooking beans and coffee in the battered pot they had packed, and lying under a sky that was so thick with stars it looked almost solid. On the second night, with the cattle settled and the fire burning low, she lay on her bedroll and looked up at the stars and said, "Thomas used to say that the sky out here was proof that the universe had no sense of proportion." Paul was lying on his own bedroll a respectful distance away, and he was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a thoughtful man," he said. "He was," she said. "He was not perfect. He could be hard-headed and he made decisions too fast sometimes, and he bought that seat on credit when he should have waited another year. But he was good. He was genuinely good, which is rarer than it ought to be." "Do you miss him terribly?" Paul asked, and the question was gentle, the way you ask something that matters. "Every day," she said. "But it is changing, the missing. It was sharp at first. Now it is more like an ache that you live alongside rather than a wound that keeps opening." "That sounds like healing," Paul said. "I think it might be," she said. She turned her head and found that he was looking at her across the space between their bedrolls, and the firelight was catching the angles of his face, and she thought that he was a very good-looking man, which was not something she had allowed herself to think directly before, though the fact of it had been sitting in the background of her awareness for weeks. "I have not done this before," she said. "Whatever this is." "Which part?" he said. "Feeling this way about someone new," she said. "After someone else." "I know," he said. "Neither have I exactly." "You have not been married," she said. "No," he said. "I've cared about someone before and lost it in the way that is not death but is its own kind of ending and rebuilt from it. So I understand a version of what you are describing." "What happened?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "A woman in New Mexico territory," he said. "Her family was against it, and she was not strong enough to go against her family, and I was not the kind of man her family wanted for her, which was a man with land and money and a name they recognized. I do not blame her. I blame the system that made her feel she had no choice." "That is generous of you," she said. "It took time to get to generous," he said honestly, "but I got there." She thought about that, about the long road between loss and generosity, the way it requires you to understand someone else's position even when it hurts you. She liked that he had made that journey. "Paul," she said. "Yes. I think I might be falling in love with you," she said, because she was a woman who, when she had finally decided something, said it plainly. "I want to be honest about it because I have never been good at pretending things are not happening when they clearly are." The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere out in the darkness. The cattle moved softly in their sleep. "Harriet," he said, and the way he said her name was completely different from any other way it had ever been said in her whole life. "I have been falling in love with you since you stopped your horse on that road and told me about your farm without a single word of self-pity, and I have been trying not to say so because I was afraid of making things harder for you." "You are not making things harder," she said. "You are making them considerably more complicated, but that is different from harder." "Complicated I can work with," he said. "So can I," she said. They looked at each other across the firelit space between them, and then they went to sleep, because they had 30 cattle to drive in the morning and $340 to earn. And love, as both of them understood well, is something you build in the small moments around the large work, not instead of it. Breckett in Wichita Falls turned out to be a solid, matter-of-fact man who ran a stockyard with the kind of efficient pride that comes from doing something honestly for a long time. He inspected the cattle personally, walking through the herd with a practiced eye, squeezing flanks and checking hooves with the same quiet thoroughness that Paul had shown on the farm, and at the end of it he looked up and said, $2.30 a head. They are better conditioned than I expected." $2.30 times 30 was $69. It was $2.50 more than the estimate, and Harriet shook Breckett's hand with a grip that made him blink and then grin. "Your cattle?" he asked. "My farm," she said. "My cattle." On the ride home, with the money folded in the inside pocket of her coat and the herdless prairie opening around them, she felt lighter than she had in months. Not because the problem was fully solved yet, because there was still the timber sale and Paul's loan to finalize, but because it was solvable. The horizon looked different when a problem is solvable, wider and less threatening. Paul rode beside her, easy in the saddle, and they talked about small things and large things in the way of people who are discovering that they can talk about both equally well together. They talked about the farm's future, about what the following spring might look like if they managed the recovery correctly, about potentially increasing the herd to 60 or 70 head, which the acreage could reasonably support. They talked about the possibility of a better water management system along the creek, drawing on what he had learned in New Mexico. "You are thinking about staying," she said at one point, not as an accusation but as an observation. He looked at her sideways, and there was the warmth in his face that she had come to love without fully meaning to. "I am thinking about a good many things," he said. "Stay specific," she said. He laughed, and she had come to love the sound of it, the deep, genuine quality of it. "I am thinking that this farm could be something remarkable with the right care," he said. "I am thinking that I have not felt at home anywhere in 12 years, and I feel it here. And I am thinking that there is a woman on this farm who I would very much like to stay for if she will have me." Harriet kept her eyes on the road ahead for a few seconds, feeling the warmth of it move through her. "She will have you," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, which was still gloved against the October chill, and she held his, and they rode that way for a mile, which is the kind of thing that you do not need words around. They arrived back at the farm on the 5th day to find Orville sitting on the porch with a look of strained dignity that turned out to be the aftermath of a visit from 2 of Calhoun's men, who had apparently come by to suggest, in terms that were not quite threatening, but were meant to be understood that way, that Mrs. Gentry might want to reconsider the land sale in light of the approaching bank deadline. Orville had sent them off with a concise expression of his feelings on the matter, which he delivered to Harriet and Paul with the straightforward tone of a man who is not proud of the specific language he employed, but is not particularly ashamed of it either. "He is getting nervous," Paul said, meaning Calhoun. "Good," Harriet said. She went to see Marcus Howe the next morning about the timber. He was a builder of the old school, careful and particular, who worked out of a shop on the south end of Millhaven and had a reputation for doing things right. He came out to the northern boundary of the farm, walked through the stand of post oak and cedar, made his assessments quietly, and then offered her $108, which was 3 more than Paul had estimated. "I will take it," she said. "It will take my crew 2 weeks to cut and haul," he said. "I will have the first payment to you by Friday of next week." She walked back to the farm with her numbers running in her head: 69 from the cattle, 44 from the wheat, 108 from the timber. That was $221, plus Paul's loan of $115. That was $336, $4 short. She told Paul that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. $4, he said. $4, she confirmed. He reached into his coat pocket and put $4 on the table without a word. She looked at the $4 and then at him, and then she shook her head and started to laugh, quietly, the kind of laugh that is also relief and exhaustion and something close to joy all layered together. "You are remarkable," she told him. "You are the one who held this place together," he said, serious beneath the lightness. "You held it together for months alone before I arrived. All I did was help finish what you had already started." "Do not minimize what you did," she said. "Do not minimize what you did," he said back. She looked at the money on the table. $340 assembled from wheat and cattle and timber and a man's savings, and $4 from his coat pocket, 1 through 60 days of work that had started before sunrise and ended after dark, through a drought and a grieving and a threat from a man with lacquered wheels who thought grief could be leveraged. "Tomorrow," she said, "I am going to the bank." "I will come with you," he said. "You do not have to," she said. "I know," he said. She went to the bank the next morning with Paul Chandler beside her and Orville riding behind, because Orville had said he would not be left out of this particular errand, and no one had argued with him. She walked into the Caldwell Savings and Loan with $340 in an envelope and placed it on the desk of the loan officer, A thin young man named Pemberton who had always been awkward in her presence and was more awkward than ever now. "Full payment," she said. "On the Gentry property note, I would like a receipt." He counted the money twice, which she expected, and then wrote out a receipt in a very careful hand, and then stamped it with the bank seal, and then handed it to her. She folded it and put it in her pocket next to the original foreclosure notice that she had been carrying there since the beginning. She came out of the bank into the October morning sunlight with the deed clear, and the note paid, and the farm fully hers, and she stood on the steps of the Caldwell Savings and Loan and felt the sun on her face and did not cry, which she had promised herself. But it was a near thing. Paul was standing at the base of the steps watching her, and she came down to him and he looked at her with an expression that held everything they had been through in the past 2 months in it. "Well," Orville said from behind them. "It is done," she said. Orville made a sound that was close to a cheer and too dignified to fully be one, which was exactly right for him. As they mounted their horses to ride back, Harriet saw Calhoun's carriage across the street, and Calhoun himself standing on the boardwalk watching them with an expression that was difficult to read. She met his gaze directly and held it for a moment, not with triumph exactly, but with the clear, level certainty of a woman who has just demonstrated that she does not need to sell. Then she turned her horse toward home. The weeks after the bank payment had a different quality than everything that had come before. The urgent, grinding pressure of the crisis was gone, and what replaced it was something that felt like possibility, like open water after a long time in narrow straits. The farm did not immediately transform itself, because farms do not work that way and reality does not either, but there was a settledness to the days that had not been there before, a sense that the work they were doing was building toward something stable rather than running away from something threatening. Paul stayed. He did not announce this with ceremony or lengthy discussion. He simply stayed, the same way he had simply started, and it felt as natural as weather. Harriet found herself looking at him in the mornings with a steady, warm regard that was different from the way she had looked at him in the early weeks, when she was still measuring him against her need rather than her feelings. Now she looked at him and saw him, the specific and detailed shape of who he was, his patience with Orville's slower pace, his genuine interest in every system on the farm and how it might be improved, the way he handled problems by sitting with them rather than reacting to them immediately. The way he sometimes sat on the porch in the evenings and read his Dickens and did not need conversation, and did not seem to need anything from the world in that moment but to be exactly where he was. She loved him. She had known it on the cattle drive, and she knew it more fully now, the way you know things more fully as time passes, and the initial certainty deepens into something that has texture and weight. One evening in the last week of October, she came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and found him sitting on the steps looking at the sky, which had gone a deep blue in the west where the sun had just set, and she sat beside him, closer than she usually did, their shoulders almost touching, and handed him his cup. "Paul," she said. "Harriet," he said. "I want to talk about what comes next," she said. "For the farm, for us, for all of it." He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was attentive and open and entirely present. "The farm," she began, "needs a stronger water system before next spring. The creek cannot be relied on the way it was, and I think your irrigation idea could be extended to cover the eastern field as well, not just the western one. We could potentially add 20 acres of crop next season if the water is right." "Agreed," he said. "And the herd should be built back up. I know a rancher in the next county over who is selling young cattle at a fair price. 10 good animals in the spring, plus keeping the 10 we held back, and we have 20 head to start expanding from." "I am also thinking about chickens," she said. "Real chickens, not just the laying hens but a proper operation. There is a market for dressed poultry in Millhaven, and Stefano's said he would take whatever we can produce. That is a good income stream," he said. "Low overhead, relatively fast return." She nodded, and then she was quiet for a moment and he waited. "And for us," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am 31 years old and I have been a widow for 8 months and I am in love with you," she said, "and I would like to know where you stand." He set his coffee cup down on the step beside him and turned toward her fully, and she turned toward him, and they were very close together in the gathering dark of the October evening. "I stand here," he said, which was a simple answer and exactly the right one. "I want to stay on this farm. I want to help you build it into what it should be. I want to be here for every season, not just the hard ones." He paused. "I want to marry you, Harriet, if you will have me. Not right now, because you are still healing and because I believe in doing things in proper order, but I want you to know that it is what I want." She looked at him for a long moment in the blue dusk, this man who had appeared on a fence post on a September morning and said, "Let us start today," and then proceeded to mean every word of it. "Not right now," she agreed, "but yes." He reached up and touched her face with his hand, just once, just gently, and she leaned into it the way you lean into warmth. And he kissed her then, quietly and carefully, and it was the kind of kiss that does not try to be everything at once but trusts that there is time. November arrived, and with it the cool, clear days that made the Texas plains a different kind of beautiful, the grass gone amber and the sky an intense blue and the air sharp enough to make you feel awake in every part of yourself. They worked on winterizing the farm, laying in hay and feed, shoring up the barn against the cold, banking the garden beds, and preparing the soil for the following spring. It was quieter work than the frantic pace of the previous months, and there was a pleasure in it that came from doing it together with a clear horizon ahead. Orville seemed to expand in the change of atmosphere. He talked more than he had in months, telling stories about his younger years that were alternately funny and extraordinary, and both Harriet and Paul came to understand that Orville Beggs had lived one of the more interesting lives in the state of Texas, and had simply not found many people worth telling it to until now. He had come west in 1845, before the war, before most of the big cattle drives, when the land was genuinely wild in ways that were difficult to fully convey to people who had only known it after the railroad came. He had been a scout briefly for one of the early survey expeditions, which was where he had sustained the leg injury that stayed with him, not in any dramatic fashion, but in a fall from a horse on a rain-slicked hillside in the Guadalupe Mountains that broke his leg badly, and was set imperfectly by a doctor who was doing his best with what he had. He had worked every kind of ranch job after that, and he had stayed with the Gentry farm because Thomas had been a fair man who paid on time and respected the work, and he had stayed after Thomas died because Harriet was someone he could not in good conscience leave alone. "You are like a father to her," Paul said to him one morning when they were working together on the barn roof, replacing some boards that had warped over the summer. "I suppose I am something like that," Orville said, without looking up from his work. "She does not need a father, mind you. She is fully capable of running her own life, but she deserves someone who is looking out for her regardless." "Yes," Paul said. "She does." Orville looked at him then with those old, assessing eyes. "You are going to be good to her," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Paul said. "I am." Orville went back to his board. "Then we understand each other," he said. December was cold and quiet and good in the way that cold, quiet December days are good when you are inside a warm house with people you care about, and the year's hard work is behind you and the New Year's hope is ahead. They celebrated Christmas with the kind of simple, genuine warmth that requires more feeling than money. Harriet made a proper Christmas dinner from the stores in the root cellar, roasted chicken and sweet potatoes and corn bread, and Stefano's Papadakis came out from town with a bottle of good whiskey and a jar of fig preserves, because he had told her months ago that he would come for Christmas dinner, and he was a man who kept his promises. It was a table full of laughter and stories, and Harriet looked around it at Orville and Stefano's and Paul, these men who had each in their own way been part of saving her farm and her life, and she felt a fullness that went beyond gratitude, something closer to grace. After dinner, Stefanos pulled Paul aside in the way that men of a certain age pull younger men aside when they want to say something direct without an audience, and she saw them talking in the doorway of the parlor, Stefanos's large hands moving in his expressive way, and Paul listening with that attentive stillness of his. She did not hear what they said, but Paul came back to the table with a small smile that told her it had been something worth hearing. Later, when Stefanos and Orville had both settled into the comfortable torpor of good food and excellent whiskey, Paul came and found her in the kitchen where she was washing the dishes, and he stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, and then came in and picked up a cloth and dried while she washed, which was not a thing that most men of that time and place would have thought to do. Stefanos was telling me that Thomas used to say this farm would outlast every doubt, Paul said. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas believed in the land, she said. He believed it would provide if you worked it honestly. He was right, even though he did not live to see it. He would be glad about what happened this season, Paul said. He would, she said. He would also have opinions about you. Would he have approved? Paul asked, and there was something genuine and careful in the question, not insecurity exactly, but a real desire to know. She thought about Thomas honestly, about who he was and what he valued. He valued honesty, she said, and competence, and kindness, which he thought was underrated. He would have recognized all three in you immediately. She paused. He would have been suspicious of you for about a week, and then he would have offered you his best coffee and told you you were welcome to stay, which was his highest form of approval. Paul smiled. I would have liked him, he said. I think he would have liked you too, she said. They washed and dried in comfortable silence, and outside the window the December stars were very bright over the dark Texas plain, and the farm was quiet and whole. January came in harder than December, with a cold that settled over the land with serious intent, and they spent the early weeks of the new year tending the cattle through the cold, breaking ice on the water troughs in the mornings, and making sure the barn was properly banked against the wind. It was the kind of work that is unglamorous and relentless and absolutely necessary, and they did it with the efficiency of people who have learned to work well together. It was during a particularly bitter cold snap, in the second week of January of 1883, that Paul found an old almanac in the barn that had belonged to Thomas, a farming almanac with Thomas's handwriting in the margins, notes about soil conditions and planting times and observations about the land written in a small, careful hand. He brought it in to her in the evening and set it on the table, and she looked at it and traced the handwriting with one finger. I had forgotten he kept this, she said. He had good instincts, Paul said. His notes on the eastern field match what I observed about the soil composition. He knew what this land could do. She read through some of the pages while Paul sat across from her, and it was not painful in the way she had feared it might be. It was more like a conversation she could still have with Thomas, hearing his thinking through his words on the page, and understanding that he would have wanted her to use this, to learn from it, to make the farm better with it. She looked up from the almanac to find Paul watching her with an expression of such gentle regard that she felt her heart press against her ribs with something warm and certain. I want to get married in the spring, she said. He did not look surprised, but his face changed in a way that was beautiful to watch, something opening in it like a door. Then we will get married in the spring, he said. April, she said, after the planting, before the real heat comes. April, he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the cold winter pressing against the windows and the farm warm and held around them. February was planning and preparation, and the gradual, hopeful return of longer days. Paul rode to the neighboring county and came back with a price on 8 young cattle that he had negotiated carefully, and they agreed to purchase them in March when the weather turned. Harriet began the spring planting plans using Thomas's almanac alongside her own observations, and the combination of the two felt right, felt like the past and present working together rather than at odds with each other. She wrote a letter to her sister in Abilene, who she had not seen in 2 years, and told her about Paul and about the farm being saved and about the April wedding. And her sister's reply came back quick and full of the kind of enthusiasm that only sisters can generate, promising to come in the middle of March and stay through the ceremony. Her sister's name was Charlotte, and she was 3 years younger than Harriet and had the same strong jaw and direct brown eyes, and a laugh that was considerably louder, which Harriet had always secretly admired. Charlotte arrived on the stage from Abilene on a mild March morning, descending onto the Millhaven Main Street with 2 large bags and an immediate comprehensive assessment of Paul Chandler that she delivered to Harriet later that evening with the directness of someone who has no time to be coy. "He is a very good-looking man," Charlotte said. "I am aware," Harriet said. "And he is very obviously in love with you," Charlotte said. "I know," Harriet said. "And you are in love with him," Charlotte said. "Charlotte," Harriet said. "I am just confirming what is plain to see," Charlotte said. "You have good taste, Harriet, you always have." Charlotte was a force of nature in the way of people who move through the world at high speed with complete confidence in their direction, and her arrival enlivened the farm in ways that were sometimes exhausting and always entertaining. She took an immediate and apparently sincere interest in the chicken operation that Harriet was building, which was growing from the original 24 hens into something more serious. She helped with the spring garden planting, working beside Harriet in the kitchen garden with a cheerful, proficient speed that surprised everyone. She and Paul developed a rapport that Harriet observed with pleasure. Charlotte asked him direct questions and he answered them directly, and she seemed to appreciate this about him, because she had a low tolerance for people who spoke around things. She asked him once, quite frankly, what his intentions were regarding her sister and the farm, and he told her just as frankly, and Charlotte apparently found the answer satisfactory because she never brought it up again. "He told me the truth," Charlotte said to Harriet afterward. "He said he plans to stay on this farm for the rest of his life, and that he loves you, and that he is aware of how recent Thomas's death is, and that he does not take any of it lightly." "He said all that," Harriet said. "He said it without being asked to elaborate," Charlotte said. "A man who volunteers that information without embellishment is a man you can trust." The 8 young cattle arrived in late March, driven over from the neighboring county by the rancher Paul had negotiated with, a stout man named Delbert Crane, who shook Harriet's hand and told her she had a fine piece of land and that she had a good eye for cattle, neither of which was entirely accurate yet, but both of which she appreciated. The new cattle settled into the herd quickly under Paul's management, and the total herd of 18 head looked considerably healthier than the original 40 had at the worst of the previous summer's drought. The spring planting went better than she had allowed herself to hope. Using Thomas's almanac notes and Paul's practical knowledge, and the improved irrigation system that Paul and Orville had extended over the winter, they got 60 acres of wheat planted in conditions that were about as good as they could be, with reasonable moisture in the soil from the winter rains, and the creek running fuller than it had in the previous year. They planted a kitchen garden that was larger and more ambitious than the previous years. The chicken operation was fully up and running, with 32 laying hens and a dozen young birds being raised for the autumn market, and Stefano's was already taking 24 eggs a week for the general store. The farm was coming alive. She could feel it the way you feel something that has been held still finally beginning to move, the circulation returning to something that had been cold. The wedding was on the 14th of April, 1883, on a morning that was clear and mild and smelled of fresh grass and turned earth and the particular golden quality of Texas spring, which is the most beautiful and fleeting thing on the southern plains. They were married at the Millhaven Church by the minister, a serious young man from Georgia named Reverend Albright, who had come to Millhaven the previous fall and was still finding his way in a congregation that was practical and affectionate but not especially patient with lengthy sermons. The ceremony was simple, which was what both of them wanted. Charlotte stood beside Harriet in a dress the color of cream, beaming with a warmth that made her beautiful in a way that she always was, but sometimes did not recognize in herself. Orville stood beside Paul with the rigid dignity of a man who is feeling more than he intends to show, holding his hat in both hands and watching the proceedings with an expression that he apparently thought was neutral and was in fact radiant. Stefanos was in the second pew with his wife, Alina, whom Harriet adored, and who had brought a dish of Greek honey cakes for the celebration afterward that were unlike anything anyone in Millhaven had ever tasted. Several other townspeople were there, people from the community who had watched the Gentry farm struggle and then fight back and come out the other side, and their presence felt warm and genuine rather than merely social. When Reverend Albright asked Harriet if she took Paul Chandler for her husband, she looked at Paul directly and said yes with a completeness that filled the small church. When he asked Paul if he took Harriet Gentry for his wife, Paul looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that steady, full regard that she had come to feel was one of the most valuable things in her life, and said yes. They walked out of the church into the April sunshine as the Chandlers, and the world had the quality it sometimes has in great moments of looking like exactly what it should. The celebration at the farm afterward was the kind that happens when people have genuine reasons to be glad. Charlotte had organized it with impressive efficiency, and the long table in the yard was covered with food brought by neighbors and friends, cornbread and ham and greens and Stefanos's wife's honey cakes, and a punch that was mostly wholesome, and the remainder satisfyingly less so. Orville played a fiddle that no one had known he possessed, sitting on a stump near the barn with his bad leg stretched out in front of him, and his bow moving with a lightness that suggested the fiddle was where his body remembered being young, and people danced in the yard as the afternoon went golden and then pink. Paul danced with Harriet, which he did without particular skill but with complete willingness, and she did not care at all about the skill because the willingness was the whole point. He held her with a care that was also firmness, the way he did everything, and she felt in his arms the same thing she had felt since the beginning, which was someone who was genuinely there. "Husband," she said, because she wanted to say it out loud, to hear it in the open air. "Wife," he said, and smiled down at her. Charlotte danced with Orville, which was apparently Charlotte's idea, and which Orville accepted with the air of a man who has been caught off guard by something he does not entirely dislike. He was a better dancer than you would expect from a 63-year-old man with a bad leg, and Charlotte laughed and matched him, and Paul and Harriet watched them for a moment with the particular fondness of people who love the people they are watching. The summer of 1883 was kinder than the previous year, not easy, because the land never made anything easy and the work was always full and demanding, but kinder. The wheat grew straighter and fuller. The cattle filled out through the season. The chicken operation began producing income that went a little way each week toward building up a reserve that had never really existed before. The irrigation system held through a dry patch in July that would have badly damaged the previous year's crop, and instead merely inconvenienced this one. Paul rode out to the fields every morning with the same calm, purposeful energy that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and she rode out beside him now as a matter of course, and they talked through every decision together with the ease of people who trust each other's judgment and are not afraid to disagree when they see things differently. They disagreed occasionally about which pasture to move the cattle to first, about the best timing for the second planting, and these disagreements were brief and straightforward, and resolved without residue, which was a thing she valued more than she had words for. Orville's health was good that summer, better than it had been the previous year, which she attributed partly to having more regular company and partly to having something clear to contribute to, because Orville was a man who needed to be useful. He had become the primary manager of the chicken operation, which suited him with an unexpectedness that delighted everyone. He had an instinct for it, a patience with the animals, and a methodical care in the feeding and management that produced results. The first fall market day, his dressed chickens sold out before noon. In September, Harriet discovered that she was pregnant. She told Paul in the kitchen on a Sunday morning when the light was coming in at a low, golden angle, and the coffee was hot, and the farm was quiet in the particular way of Sunday mornings. She told him simply, as was her habit, looking at him across the table with the news in her eyes before it was in her words. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands and looked at her with an expression that she had no single word for but that contained everything that mattered. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was what he said first, and she loved him for it. "I am very well," she said. "I am healthy and I am strong and I have every reason to expect this to go normally." He held her hands and looked at her for another long moment and then said quietly, "Harriet, I cannot describe what I am feeling." "Try," she said. "Terrified," he said. "Grateful, more in love with you than I was 5 minutes ago, which I would not have thought possible." He paused. "Like the world just got larger and I want to be equal to it." "You will be," she said. "We will be," he said. She smiled. "Yes," she said, "we will be." She wrote to Charlotte, who sent back a reply that was 2 full pages of enthusiasm and practical advice and clear emotion, written in the large, exuberant hand that had always made her letters instantly recognizable. She told Orville that same afternoon, and Orville's response was to set down the harness he had been mending, look at the middle distance for a moment in the way of someone absorbing something significant, and then say with great simplicity, "That is good news. That is very good news." Then he picked up the harness again, and that was that, which was Orville at his most eloquent. Stefanos and Alina Papadakis celebrated with actual Greek dancing in the general store, which was a thing that Harriet and Paul witnessed with pure delight, and that became one of those stories you tell for years. The autumn of 1883 passed in a fullness that was unlike anything Harriet had experienced before. The pregnancy progressed well, and her body, which had always been strong and capable, met the demands of it with a practical cooperation that she found reassuring. She kept working, because Harriet Gentry did not stop working due to pregnancy any more than she stopped due to grief or drought or bank notices. But she was honest about what she could and could not do, and Paul was attentive without being overprotective, which was exactly the right balance. The wheat harvest that autumn was the best the Gentry farm had produced in 3 years. Not a dramatic abundance, because the land had its limitations and the season had had its difficulties, but a solid, real harvest that sold for enough to pay down the loan Paul had made to the farm, with a portion paid directly to him with proper interest, and the remainder retained for the spring seed and supplies. He had tried to argue against the interest, and she had insisted on it with a firmness that concluded the argument. "I am not going to be in business with my husband on unfair terms," she said. "If I owe interest to the bank, I owe it to you as well. That is how it works." He looked at her with that expression he got sometimes, admiring and amused and deeply affectionate all at once. "You are a formidable woman," he said. "I am a fair woman," she said. "There is a difference." "Not always as large as people think," he said. The cattle that year, the 18 head plus the natural increase of 4 calves born through the summer, totaled 22 head going into autumn. They sold 10 of the older animals in October and kept 12 going into winter, which was a solid foundation for the herd they were building. The chicken operation had become a reliable monthly income, and Orville ran it with a proprietary pride that was wonderful to see in a man who had spent 63 years being proud of many things, but never, apparently, chickens. Winter came on gently in 1883, as though it had decided to be kind for once, and the farm settled into its cold season rhythms, the shorter days, the tending of the indoor animals, the careful management of the stored feed and food, the evenings long and lamplight warm inside the farmhouse. Harriet sat with Paul in the evenings, and they talked about the spring, about the child coming in late spring or early summer, about the expansion they were planning for the herd, about a second planting field they had been preparing on the northern edge of the property that would come into production the following year. They read to each other sometimes, the Dickens novel and a copy of a George Eliot that Charlotte had sent as a wedding gift, and sometimes they sat in comfortable silence that needed nothing added to it. She thought sometimes about the morning she had found the bank notice on the door, that September morning in 1882, when the farm had seemed to be slipping away from her like water through her hands, and the same day she had ridden out on Biscuit and found a man sitting on a fence post looking at the plain. She thought about how thin that margin had been, how different everything might have been. She also thought about her own part in it, which she was honest with herself about. She had not given up. She had never, not for a single day, allowed herself to accept that the farm was lost before she had exhausted every possibility. That stubbornness, which Thomas had sometimes found infuriating, had been the thing that kept her on horseback that September day, riding toward a stranger on a fence post rather than riding home to wait for the inevitable. It had been her insistence on starting, on acting, on moving toward rather than away, that had made the whole thing possible. Paul had been the grace in it, the unexpected grace, the person whose arrival had taken what was possible in theory and made it actual. But she had been the one who created the conditions for that grace by refusing to stop. She thought about that with satisfaction on a January evening, sitting by the fire with her hands on her growing belly and Paul reading beside her, and she felt something that was purely and completely contentment. Not the absence of difficulty, because difficulty was always going to be part of any life worth living, but the presence of something solid and good in hers. The baby came in June of 1884, on a Tuesday, which was an unremarkable day of the week for the arrival of someone who would rearrange everything in a wonderful and permanent way. It was a boy, arrived into the world with a voice that immediately demonstrated he had strong opinions about it, and he was named Thomas Paul Chandler after the two men who had made his life possible, one by loving his mother first and building something worth saving, and one by showing up and helping save it. Paul held his son for the first time with the expression of a man who has been surprised by the depth of something he thought he was prepared for, and Harriet watched him from the bed where she was tired and brilliant with it, and thought that she had never seen anything more beautiful than that. "He has your chin," Paul said. "He has your ears," she said. "Poor boy," Paul said, and she laughed, genuinely, the way she had been laughing since September of 1882, the way she expected to laugh for the rest of her life. Orville, when the baby was brought out to meet him, stood very straight and held little Thomas with extreme care, as though he were something both precious and mildly explosive, and said, with great deliberateness, "Hello, young man. You have come into a very good place," which was entirely true. Charlotte came from Abilene when she received the letter, arriving on the stage 6 days after the birth, and taking over the household with affectionate efficiency for 2 weeks, feeding everyone and cleaning everything, and telling Thomas Paul stories about his mother's childhood that Harriet could not exactly object to because they were, inconveniently, all accurate. The summer of 1884 was the best the farm had ever seen. The new northern field came into production. The herd grew steadily. The chicken operation had expanded to the point where Orville had recruited 2 local boys to help him on market days. And the farm's income for the year, when Paul added it all up at the kitchen table in October with the same careful notebook and stub of pencil he had always used, was enough to live on well and save something besides. The Gentry Chandler farm, as it was beginning to be known in Millhaven, was not a grand operation. It was not Calhoun's empire of absorbed land and leveraged debt. It was 900 acres of worked, honest, productive earth, managed by 2 people who understood it and loved it and had fought for it, and an aging man named Orville who had become so woven into the fabric of the place that to imagine the farm without him was to imagine it incomplete. Calhoun had made one more attempt, in the spring of 1884, to purchase the property, sending a letter with an improved offer that was still not remotely fair. Harriet had written back a brief and courteous reply declining, and had not heard from him again. The farm had won. Not by being dramatic about it, not by defeating Calhoun in any spectacular way, but simply by surviving and then thriving, and by becoming so clearly, solidly itself, that it was no longer possible to imagine it as anything else. On a September morning, exactly 2 years after Harriet had found the bank notice on her door and ridden out on Biscuit to find a stranger on a fence post, she stood on the porch of the farmhouse with a baby on her hip and her husband beside her and the autumn sun climbing the pale Texas sky, and looked out across her land. The wheat field, the whole 90 acres of it now, was harvested, and the stubble stood golden in the light. The cattle were grazing in the far pasture, fat and calm. The chickens were in their yard, conducting their small domestic dramas with characteristic intensity. Biscuit, ancient and dignified and still going, was in the corral, watching the world with the philosophical patience of the very old. Paul stood beside her with his coffee, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and Thomas Paul, who was 3 months old and had discovered that the world was full of interesting things to look at, was looking at the morning with the round-eyed seriousness of an infant who has been assigned the important task of observing everything. 2 years ago, she said. I know, he said. You showed up at the right moment, she said. You rode out to find me, he said. That is the more important fact. She thought about that. About the woman who had folded the bank notice into her pocket and gone to work, and then ridden into town and then ridden out toward the Reardon place looking for someone who could help, because she had decided that there was still something worth saving, and she was not going to let it go without trying every available option. We showed up at the right moment, she said, which was the truest version of it. He kissed the top of her head and she held her son and the farm spread out around them in the September light, whole and living and entirely theirs, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, the farm continued to grow. Thomas Paul grew with it, learning to walk in the dirt of the yard and then to run across the fields, and he had his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness and his own particular quality of cheerfulness that seemed entirely his own. Orville taught him about the chickens with extraordinary seriousness, as if this were a matter of the gravest importance, and the boy absorbed the lessons with the earnest attention of someone who understands that the person teaching him considers it significant. In 1886, a daughter came, and they named her Rose after nothing in particular, except that she arrived in May when the wild roses along the creek bank were blooming, and the name seemed to belong to her. She had Paul's brown eyes and Harriet's decisive way of announcing her needs, and she was 3 years old when she began following Orville around the farm in a way that made the old man's face do something he would never have been willing to describe in words. The farm had become, by the late 1880s, one of the more productive small operations in Caldwell County. Not the largest, not the richest, not the most spectacular, but steady and real and respected, which in Harriet Chandler's estimation was worth considerably more than any of those other things. Paul was known in Millhaven as a fair man and a good neighbor, the kind who showed up when someone needed help with a barn raising or a cattle problem, not because it made him popular, but because it was the right thing to do. He and Harriet were the kind of couple that people liked to be around, not because they performed their happiness, but because it was genuine and therefore contagious, the warmth of two people who have built something together and know it and are glad. Orville Beggs lived on the farm until the winter of 1889, when he died peacefully in his bunk at the age of 70, and his passing was mourned by the Chandler family with a grief that was real and deep, because he had been more than a hired hand for a very long time. They buried him in the corner of the farm property, near the creek, where the cottonwood trees made a shade in summer, and the marker that Paul carved for him said his name and the dates, and then, "He was a good man," which was exactly what Orville would have wanted it to say. Charlotte married a doctor from Abilene in 1887 and came to visit every Christmas with her husband and, beginning in 1889, their own small daughter. And the farmhouse at Christmas was loud and warm and full in the way that made Harriet feel the years had been generous to her in ways she had not dared to hope for in that hard September of 1882. The farm endured. The family grew. The love that had started on a fence post outside the Reardon property, with a woman asking a stranger if he could help her save what she had built with her first husband and her own hands, deepened into the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is visible in everything, in the way two people move through a shared space, in the small decisions made together and the large ones, in the patience with each other's difficulties, and the delight in each other's small joys. Harriet Chandler was a woman who had learned early that the land requires your whole self, your intelligence and your strength, and your willingness to begin again when things fail. And she gave it all of that, and it gave her back in kind, as land does when it is honestly worked and honestly loved. Paul Chandler was a man who had spent 12 years moving in search of somewhere to put down roots, and had found it not in a grand moment of revelation, but in 5 words spoken on a September morning to a woman who needed help and said so plainly. And those roots went down into the red clay earth of Caldwell County, Texas, and held. Their farm held. Their love held. The seasons passed over it, and the family grew within it, and the story of it was the story of two people who had each survived their different losses and found their way toward something worth building, and then built it together, season after season, under the enormous blue sky of the Texas plain. And on the porch of the farmhouse in the evenings, with the children asleep and the stars coming out over the West Texas dark and the farm quiet and whole around them, Harriet and Paul Chandler sat side by side the way they always had, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the world was exactly as it should be.